Why did Ananias and Sapphira die? This is the question we seek to answer today as we continue our verse-by-verse study of the book of Acts on Walking Through the Bible.
Of his word, the glory of his cross.
Today we're going to be discussing Acts chapter 5, verses 1 to 11. Before we do that, let's read the passage. If you have a Bible with you, you can turn to Acts chapter 5, verse 1. But if you don't have a Bible, don't worry. Just follow along with us on the screen. The version that we'll be reading from is the New King James Version. So Acts chapter 5, beginning at verse 1. But a certain man named Ananias with Sapphira his wife sold a possession, and he kept back part of the proceeds, his wife also being aware of it, and brought a certain part and laid it at the apostles' feet. But Peter said, Ananias, why has Satan filled your heart to lie to the Holy Spirit and keep back part of the price of the land for yourself? While it remained, was it not your own? And after it was sold, was it not in your own control? Why have you conceived this thing in your heart? You have not lied to men, but to God. Then Ananias, hearing these words, fell down and breathed his last. So great fear came upon all those who heard these things. And the young men arose and wrapped him up, carried him out, and buried him. Now it was about 3 hours later when his wife came in, not knowing what had happened. And Peter answered her, Tell me whether you sold the land for so much. She said, Yes, for so much. Then Peter said to her, How is it that you have agreed together to test the Spirit of the Lord? Look, the feet of those who have buried your husband are at the door, and they will carry you out. Then immediately she fell down at his feet and breathed her last. And the young men came in and found her dead, and carrying her out, buried her by her husband. So great fear came upon all the church and upon all who heard these things. At the end of chapter 4, we saw that the people who had become Christians were extremely charitable with one another. If someone had a genuine need that could not be met on their own, there was someone who could help. In Jerusalem at that time, there appeared to be a consistent need, or at the very least a temporary consistent need, that spurred some of the Christians with land to sell some of their land and lay the proceeds down at the apostles' feet. It was the apostles' feet because this church was still young, and so the apostles would be best suited to ensure that this money would be dealt with the way Jesus would have wanted it to, what we would call the scriptural pattern today. The way we determine what the scriptural pattern is for benevolence today is through passages like Acts 4 through Acts 6. We met Barnabas at the end of chapter 4, a Levite from Cyprus who sold land and brought the proceeds to the apostles. This man will become important later on in this book, so make a note of him. Coming now to chapter 5, we have this collection for the needy saints continuing, with a specific story that struck fear into the early Christians, and it should cause us to recognize the seriousness of sin too. The story begins by telling us that Ananias and his wife Sapphira sold a piece of land. We don't have to be told that they were Christians, for it is evident that they were. What they both decided to do was keep back part of the proceeds and bring the rest to lay down at the apostles' feet. Up until this point, these two had done nothing wrong, for it was neither commanded nor expected that the Christians who sold land bring the total proceeds to the apostles' feet. It wasn't even commanded or expected that Christians sell land at all. But the fact is that many Christians did because there was a need to help those Christians among them that were poor. The giving that we're seeing here then is what is known as free will giving. We always think of the Old Testament giving as forced giving because of the concept of tithing. But even in the Old Testament, there were free will offerings, and giving was always to be done from the heart, out of a love for God, not out of compulsion. And if you recall back to the reason for the tithes, it was to help the priests and Levites who did not inherit land to be able to eat and survive. And you'll see the reason for tithing in the Old Testament was the very similar to the reason given here in Acts 4 and Acts 5. But as we said, up until Ananias came to Peter, neither he or his wife had done anything wrong. Now, even though it is not said when Ananias came, it is implied by what Peter would say later when he talked with Sapphira, who did not accompany her husband in giving this money, that when Ananias came to Peter, he told Peter that the money he was giving was all the proceeds of the land they sold. Peter, though, was filled with the Holy Spirit, which allowed Peter to look into Ananias' heart and find out the lie. Peter asked Ananias why Satan had filled his heart to lie to the Holy Spirit. We learn an important point here, which is when we allow sin to rule in our lives, we allow Satan to fill our hearts with sin rather than the Holy Spirit fill our hearts with righteousness. We do this at our peril, for if Satan fills our hearts, we know we're going to be on the road to hell. If the Holy Spirit fills our hearts, though, we know we're going to be on the road to heaven. What sin had Ananias allowed Satan to fill his heart with? Pride, greed, and hypocrisy, which led him to lie to the Holy Spirit. Ananias saw what other Christians were doing, and he wanted to be seen doing the same thing because he had this ability. He was obviously proud that he had this ability. However, he didn't want to give up all his money, which was greed, showing us that he really wasn't wanting to help out of a concern for the poor, but out of desire for status among the Christians as someone who was righteous when in fact he was wicked, which is hypocrisy. Satan deceived Ananias into thinking that he could fool God and the apostles in this, and nobody would be the wiser. Just as he had done to Eve, Satan lied to Ananias, and Ananias was going to pay the consequences. For Peter said that he hadn't lied to men, but to God. Now by this, Peter isn't saying that he hadn't been lied to, for he had. But what Peter is saying here is that what was being done was a work of God's church. They were coming before the apostles and giving money to help the poor, which is an act of worship to God. By saying that they were giving all the proceeds of their land sale, they were lying to God. They were thinking that they could deceive God, which of course they couldn't. This is an act of outright defiance against God here, one that comes from a heart that is not at all devoted to serving the true God of heaven, rather only doing so to be seen of men. And this is why Ananias paid with his life. This was a high-handed sin, and so God chose to make an example out of Ananias that would by him through his apostles in order to show the Christians the seriousness of not only lying and lying to God, but the seriousness of sin in general. Sometimes we can try to downplay sin, especially our sin, but God doesn't. Sin is serious, and we must root it out of our lives by following what God says. Does God act this way today? Perhaps he does, but perhaps he doesn't. That is up to him, and is not revealed to us. But lying is still lying, and if left unrepented of and unforgiven, will condemn us to hell for all eternity. Once Ananias died, he was immediately buried by the young men who were there, following Jewish custom of that time of quick burial. That Sapphira wasn't told may have been at Peter's request, we don't know. But about 3 hours later, Sapphira came to Peter, and Peter asked her about the land purchase and the land sale, and she lied about the proceeds of the sale too, just like her husband did. And just like her husband, she died immediately too, and was buried by her husband. Fear came upon all the church when they heard these things, and it really should affect us too. Don't try to minimize sin, because God doesn't. All sin can condemn us to hell, and some sin might even bring about physical death. Let's therefore not flirt with sin, but avoid it. Before closing, I'd like us to note something as we pass by. Verse 3 says that Ananias lied to the Holy Spirit, while verse 4 says that Ananias lied to God. There are some who like to deny the deity of the Holy Spirit or think that the Holy Spirit isn't a separate person of the Godhead. That is denied here in Acts 5. The Holy Spirit isn't Jesus, and he isn't the Father. He is his own person, and he is fully God, just as Jesus is fully God. To deny this is to deny the Holy Spirit and to deny God himself, and nobody who denies God will be in heaven. So that's a warning for us today as well. With that, our time is up for today. The Lord willing, we hope you'll join us for tomorrow's discussion of Acts chapter 5, verses 12 to 21, as we continue our walk through the Bible, one verse at a time. Thank you for watching today's episode. We hope that you found it edifying and ask that you not only subscribe to our channel and podcast, but that you like and share this episode among your friends, so that the saving gospel of Jesus Christ can go out to the whole world.